The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Erosion of Trust in Science.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson. It's episode 143. And we've been doing this for several years now. We've rebranded, as our audience knows, with this Vibrant Communities tagline, and that video evokes what we try to achieve. It talks about a world that's divided. And this topic of this show, Erosion of Faith in Science, is in line with the fact that I personally am a Baha'i. I think my audience knows that. One of the principles of the Baha'i faith is the essential unity of religion and science. However, it's my personal view that religion traditionally becomes corrupted over time. And today we are at the infancy of science. The scientific revolution happened relatively recently in our history. And the big problems, the big challenges, the global challenges of our modern society and civilization, as we apply science to tackle these problems and challenges, we sometimes risk making the problem worse, right? You may have heard the joke, to err is human. To really screw things up, you need a computer, or you might say technology. In fact, that famous monster book by, what was her name? Shelley? I forget the first part of her name. Frankenstein came out at the beginning of, you might say, the technological revolution, in which there was a lot of concern about these science experiments were actually creating monsters. Well, it's my position we're not totally out of the woods yet. So tonight's topic about the erosion of faith in science really comes from the fact that we are not so far removed from the COVID pandemic. Now, we had a guest on our show probably a year and a half ago, Jason Persoff. And when he was on the show before, we were still experiencing some of the restrictions from the world's response to the COVID pandemic, which included masks, lockdowns, shutting schools, businesses being destroyed because of the policies and regulations. I personally know business owners who lost their businesses because they couldn't quite keep them alive during COVID. But now we're a little bit removed from that, and there's been some evaluation, some review, some studies that are seeking to make sense of what was good, what was bad, what was ugly. So we invited Jason Persoff to join us again to have this discussion. And there he is. Welcome to the studio, Jason.
Thanks, Wade. Great to be here.
So when you were last here, if I recall properly, you were working in the field of virology. You were, let's just say somewhat prominent in your field, maybe regionally, or in any case, you were very involved on the front line in kind of a clinical hospital setting in addition to the research you were doing. Update us on that and where you're at today. Refresh our memory on who you are and what your experience and credentials are.
Sure. So you're almost correct on everything you said. So I'm a hospitalist, an internal medicine physician who practices solely inpatient medicine. So if you have a heart attack or a stroke, for example, you'll end up probably seeing my shining face. What sets me apart from other doctors is that no one ever wants to come see me. And I don't blame them, but hopefully not because of my personality. But the main role that I have at the University of Colorado Hospital is as the assistant medical director for emergency preparedness. So my background is in disaster medicine and the response to that. And while we often think of disasters as being like plane crashes, pandemics actually fall well within my wheelhouse. And early on in the COVID pandemic, it was my job to make sure that I got us set up and responding to COVID as quickly as possible. We actually started our preparations in February 2020 when we heard China was just incidentally opening up a 1,000-bed hospital in 6 weeks. You're like, oh, that's an odd thing to hear. And that's when we started our prep. So that's kind of my background.
Thank you. And I assume then you're still in that role. Has it changed dramatically as a result of COVID or in the wake of COVID, or is it very similar?
It's very interesting. Obviously, we're done from the command and control that we needed to set up for our health system back during COVID. But still very much in our emergency preparedness, we think in terms of things as all hazards. So all hazards meaning that we're constantly prepping for the next thing that could happen, bioweapon, train crash, bird flu, and emerging pathogens. And by that, I mean things like Ebola, other viral hemorrhagic fevers. And we often joke about them as COVID 2.0 because they're still very much a risk out there.
Well, we've also had a gentleman on the show here who's with FEMA explaining how that organization works, also similar in that way, emergency preparedness. And obviously in those worlds, right, your focus is a little bit different. And you're solving certain problems that we're not aware of and that we're glad that people are there who can address them and solve them and be prepared, right? Some of us, like myself, may have experience having to go through emergency preparedness training in a corporate setting. And I remember one such colorful gentleman whose tagline was predictable, preventable. It's predictable, it's preventable. Predictable, preventable. That stuck with us. If it's predictable, it's preventable.
Wow. I'd love to say that that's true. And just want a quick shout out to, hey, Plankstep. Thanks for saying hi. And
yeah. So you're saying maybe that's not so true. Maybe if it's predictable, maybe it's not preventable.
Well, yeah, the whole idea of an all hazards approach is you can respond to anything. And then there are what we call special annexes, which are dedicated to what we know. But the whole idea of preparation is preparing for what we don't know. And how are we going to keep it together when that happens?
Well, speaking of that, you mentioned February becoming aware that there were 1,000-bed hospitals being set up in China. Well, I remember hearing some vague thing about China before that, right? Because I remember meeting with, or actually now my memory may be faulty. I remember meeting with Chinese people in Milwaukee in December of that year for some Christmas, New Year's thing. And they were like fresh off the plane from China. And I remember shaking hands with them and talking in close proximity with them. Then I remember in January realizing just how out of shape I was as winter hit. And I'm at the corporate office and I'm going up and down one flight of stairs that I used to run up and run down because that's kind of how I roll. And I would get to near the top of the stairs and get to the top of the stairs and I would be gasping like a fish out of water. And for a while, like deep breaths and just feeling like I can't breathe. I can't, and I literally remember feeling like I'm not getting oxygen because I wasn't really winded. One flight of stairs, I would run up and down them 50 times a day. But I would have to like stop and just these deep breaths and just feeling like I wasn't getting anything out of the air.
Yep.
And it was so bad that I went in and saw a doctor, which I don't normally do. And I had a full EKG and they took blood tests and all this stuff. They did one of those, deep ultrasound tests. They gave my heart, because I have a heart murmur condition. They gave my heart a full clean bill of health. And I remember them asking me if I'd, traveled. So because by now COVID was becoming known. And
Mhm.
I remember thinking, and I didn't tell them I met people in China or from China because I wanted to see what they were going to come up with. So anyway, fast forward a year and a half later, they were researching blood samples in
Mhm.
Wisconsin, and they were fine because Wisconsin was one of the early states, and they were finding that people had COVID already in January in Wisconsin.
Yes. Yeah, we
And I'm
have
like,
cases probably to the end of November that have shown up in the literature.
yeah, and I recall vividly as this was emerging. There's no cases in the state yet, and there's a case in here, and then we found one here, and but it was already widespread.
Yep, that's true.
Um, and I
That's
can't
what
remember now why.
globalization does. You know,
Right, I can't remember
not
now why I
getting
was telling
viruses
you
hop
the
on
connection there.
planes.
Oh, I remember now. It's you were saying being prepared and what we don't know, right? What we don't know, what we didn't know. But I remember piecing that together and realizing I already had COVID. I know there was nothing else that was but COVID.
Well, there was flu that year too. I mean,
Yeah,
flu is
but flu doesn't cause you to not get oxygen.
not true. It can.
Okay.
It
All
can.
right. But I've
Yeah.
I've never had a flu vaccine. And I've had the flu, but I've never had any experience because I had no flu symptoms. None.
Well, and I mean that can
Unless
happen.
unless you're saying that that is a flu symptom. Okay, I had that flu symptom, but I didn't feel sick at all. Not at all.
Well, then it's probably I don't know what to say. COVID in its early stages did have a large segment of the population who did not come down with the classic viral syndrome, which the very first variant, the alpha variant, was a sinister virus. I mean, terrible.
So would you say that those symptoms were symptomatic of the alpha version of that virus?
They most certainly could have been.
Yeah.
So by far the very first version of COVID that came over that sort of rammed through into the summer of 2020 until we started getting beta, that next wave. The alpha variant was cruel in that many people didn't have symptoms, but actual real damage was being done. So you may remember that cruise that ended up
Yes.
parked in San Diego. So
And they wouldn't let the people off.
they wouldn't let the people off. Only 20% of those people actually ended up symptomatic with COVID, and some of them severely. The CAT scans on all the people who came off the boat showed lung damage, so there was lung damage on that initial COVID, even though they never had symptoms. So that fits.
So what was the mortality rate on that ship?
I don't remember. I don't want to speak out of turn, but there were deaths, and it's an interesting thing. I want to reflect briefly on what Gunnar just put in the chat. A lot of people, and it's okay that you think this. The people who died from COVID died from COVID. COVID and flu play really nice together. You can have COVID and flu at the same time. It's a bit unusual with many viruses. When you have a virus, that virus dominates your immune system, and your immune system gets so ramped up, it's hard for another infection to coexist. So it's one of the weird things. But natural immunity actually is very poor for respiratory viruses. I wish it were better. There are some diseases we get and we're done. But COVID and all the respiratory viruses, that's not the case. There is no lifelong immunity to any of the respiratory viruses.
Which is why they recommend a new flu vaccine every year.
Correct.
And there's the whole A/B thing. And so what kind of, and this is a question that I've always been curious of what, if any, kind of residual immunity is there at all? Because one sort of fantasy that I have around my own likely contraction of that alpha COVID variation
How
was
long
that
are you going to stay immune? Yeah.
no was that one of the reasons I had no flu symptoms is because I have had the flu when it comes through, and my body has built up a certain resistance to some of those strains through natural immunity, and that it was the unique COVID variation, which personally my belief is that yes, there was gain of function research, and yes, the COVID virus specifically does have a connection to the Wuhan lab, which bears the name of the Wuhan virus, COVID from Wuhan. I believe there is a connection there, and that there was some specific genetic variation that was what I was experiencing, because that was something my immune system had not previously encountered. What do you say to that fantasy theory?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you that we can confirm where COVID came from, because I think, the Chinese have been very sketchy on this, and it's been unfortunate because regardless of where it came from, it was unleashed. It happens, and that can happen with any respiratory virus. They can mutate very easily. But that said, so our immune system is really amazing, but it needs training. So we have cells in our body which train the immune system based on the infections we have or the vaccines we receive. And when you get a vaccine or you get an infection, you're training your immune system to tackle that specific thing. And unfortunately, the reality is that that immunity does not cross. So, for example, and you'll take this wherever you want, but when you get a measles vaccine, that doesn't prevent you from getting chickenpox because of that. And the same thing is true with natural immunity. So flu is very interesting in that actually, so not a small percentage of people die. 40,000 people die per year from flu. 40,000 people, that's more than people die in car accidents. And I love when people say it's not rocket science. No one's trying to scare. Okay, we can talk about big pharma in a minute, and I do believe there's a problem with big pharma, but I do want to point out that when you look at deaths from influenza after the vaccine was released in 1960, there was a precipitous drop off in the number of people dying from influenza. The reality is that these viruses mutate over time, and so vaccines need to be updated over time. Flu in countries where there isn't good vaccination is a major cause of death. Now, the leading causes of death in the world, if you go for Western civilization, are cardiovascular disease and cancer. Turns out some of the cancers that we know of may have a viral etiology to them. So, for example, throat and neck cancer can be associated with Epstein-Barr virus, which most antibody studies show that 90%, 95% of all people by the age of 30 have already built up an immunity against. But nevertheless, if you have this infection, you're not immune, you can actually get cancer from this. Another great example is looking at the Gardasil vaccine, which is targeting a virus that can cause penile cancer as well as cervical cancer. And those rates have dropped precipitously since that was released. So I understand people feeling very uncomfortable around this issue of vaccination and the drug companies making millions of dollars. But in this case, this is actually a crossover with public health. No, again, you can look up the numbers.
So let me grab control of the narrative here for a second, because I want to get to a more fundamental question. And Thank you, Gunnar. I'm not trying to shut you down. And thank you for showing up. We're going to air your sneak peek, and I'm glad you're here. And we're going to air your sneak peek for you coming on the show. Glad to see you. But I want to get to the definition of vaccine, because the show title is Erosion of Faith in Science. And Fauci was also brought up. We'll get to him as well. So we will address these questions. But let's start with vaccine. I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the whole vaccine around COVID was sold as a vaccine, meaning the traditional understanding of what vaccine means in the minds of the people who get vaccines, which is that a vaccine prevents you from getting the disease. That is what people have generally understood.
And that's generally wrong.
Let me finish my comment. I believe it to be true that there was an update to the definition of vaccine on some official site intended to deal with vaccinations in the US throughout the COVID process. And when you suddenly change change the meaning of a term on something so important, that would go a long way to eroding faith, right? Kind of like a bait and switch. Oh no, we never said this would prevent it from happening.
There's never been a vaccine that says it prevents disease completely. There are degrees of percentages. One of the biggest mistakes that people assume is that you're not going to get the disease. There are some vaccines which that is actually 100% true, and smallpox is a very good example of this. Smallpox vaccination is 100% effective, and we stopped doing it because we eradicated the virus on this planet, except in certain labs, and that's because
right. And when points like this are brought up,
but wait. No, you made a statement. Let me go back.
Yeah.
You're not done.
Yeah.
Not done. Okay. The flu vaccination is only 45% likely to prevent the disease. Now, you may say, what's the value of that? It is very effective at preventing hospitalization and death. And so when you talk about vaccines, it's important to understand what the goal is. And anybody who the goal with COVID was to stop people from dying, which the COVID vaccine definitely did. And there were some randomized, not intentionally randomized, some very good data to show the rates of death. Now, I'm not going to go into politics. I'm just going to tell you the facts. We found, if you look at deaths from COVID, and you look at it by the counties, whether they voted blue or voted red, and first you look at the vaccination rates in those two, they're very, very different. So liberals tend to get vaccinated. Conservatives in certain parts of the country tend not to get vaccinated to the same degree. The mortality rate between those counties was very starkly different. And that was after 2 years of data. People who were not vaccinated in the red counties died at a much higher rate from COVID. Now, that's what the vaccine does, and that's evidence-based. Did it stop people from getting COVID? No. And like I said, early on, the early variants, it was very common for people to have very few symptoms of COVID. And it's an interesting comment in the chat, nothing will stop people from dying. That's not true. You wear your seatbelts. That stops you from dying in a car accident. So there are things we can do. People die eventually, of course. The goal is to have good health until you die. And that's my point. Now you can have the show back. Wait, I give it back to you.
No, it's totally fine, and I appreciate. I'm sorry for trying to interrupt you. We'll cover this last point, then we'll go to commercial break and invite another participant into this discussion, and it will make it even more interesting. The point I wanted to make, though, is when we're talking about vaccines, and I appreciate you highlighting that the smallpox vaccine is close to 100% effective. Whenever anyone begins to raise this question, the smallpox vaccine is instantly always brought up as the reason why it's so important. But you yourself are saying, oh no, that's different. That one might be very effective, but no one's saying vaccines are that effective. And yet the smallpox vaccine is the one that always is brought up to defend why one should get vaccines. Do you feel that's not a little bit sketchy, frankly, in terms of trying to educate?
So here's the problem. You want to get to the real problem and the real root of why you brought me here in part. The real problem is that we in the scientific community do a horrible job of communicating with the public. Now, there's several reasons why this occurs. One of which is we have an absolutely horrific education system in this country. So we're not educating people. And this problem is getting worse over time. And, my wife went to school.
I have to go on a quick digression. So is it a good thing that we just abolished the Department of Education then? I'm saying this with a tongue in cheek.
Okay, I'm not going to get into that because I think that, people who have children with disabilities definitely don't take a very kind view of what just happened. It was cruel. Do I think that there's waste in government? Absolutely. But so far we haven't hit it. But talking to me when you get through the Department of Defense. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, people are not not educated well, and that's unfortunate because one of the things you learn about science is that it is fallible, it self-corrects, and things evolve over time. So even in my own career, where we had drugs that we used to say never ever give to somebody in heart failure, are now the mainstay of that as we've learned more over time. Science evolves over time. And one of the things that people aren't used to is uncertainty. One of the reasons that I think that Trump is very appealing to a lot of people is because he's definitive. He believes what he believes and he states it and he does it. And that's great for people who like what he does. I don't, but that doesn't mean that it's
people's minds are blown that he actually is trying to fulfill many of his campaign promises.
I mean, like, no one saw that coming, right? He only said it. But that said, people like the safety of that. They like to have an enemy. They like to have a definitive solution. Science is not that. And the problem is,
well, unless the enemy is a virus and the definitive solution is a vaccine, but go ahead.
But my point is, people talk about, not wanting scientists to talk down. I think those scientists who aren't effective at communicating, and believe me, there are a bunch, come at it from, you're just going to have to take my word on this. If we had a better science literacy in this country, we could have a conversation that would actually make sense. But instead, it comes from on high, and that's not what people want. They want something definitive that's true, and that's it.
Well, I think what people want has been changing. I mean, my aunts in Sweden, right? Good example of this. They want to trust in the doctor, right? They want to do what the doctor tells them to do. They want to be told by the doctor what to do.
Yeah, I don't agree with that either. I want people to participate in their care and ask the tough questions. And when
I'm just saying that's the generation. It's a generational thing, and it's a cultural thing, and
it's a cultural.
Things are changing, right? It's good that there's more skepticism. We might hate it on the one hand, but independent investigation of reality and truth is one of the primary tenets of this show.
Except for the way that people go about that is often along the uneducated route. So when people aren't willing to fact check, don't know where the sources come from, can't interpret a study, that's the problem. Is that,
and that's a perfect segue into the next segment. So we're going to go to commercial break. When we come back, thank you. It's like we programmed you to do that.
I mean, what weird.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
The Healing Connection, a partnership for your health. All physicians, particularly those in primary care, are under constant pressure from administrators to be more productive, despite caring for more significant numbers of patients with increasingly challenging health concerns. They also force physicians to spend less time with each patient. While expanded numbers of patient encounters benefit the bottom-line administrators who are constantly watching, the result can lead to frustration and anxiety on both sides, with physicians sensing they may have missed something during their evaluation, and patients feeling their concerns were not acknowledged. This book addresses this current situation in American healthcare, showing how a strong patient-physician relationship can help overcome the obstacles imposed by entities seeking to commoditize healthcare delivery in our country. Dr. Drew Ray-Mignanti firmly believes this solid and trustworthy doctor-patient connection is the key to superior and more cost-effective outcomes. The Healing Connection is now available for pre-order at soupllc.com. Scan the QR code to secure your copy today.
Welcome back to Creating the Image of God with Jason Persoff. We're talking about the erosion of faith in science as a result of, yes, the COVID pandemic and other things that we're throwing into the mix now and then. Right before the break, we said we were going to get into, what was it we said we were going to get into there, Jason, that you teed up so nicely?
A little bit about studies and interpreting them.
Okay. So joining us in the studio now is my beautiful wife, Angela, who has been on this show a few times in the past, mostly around one of her passions, regenerative farming. But tonight she's here with us because she's the doctor in the family. She has a doctorate in physical therapy, and she practices evidence-based therapy. So welcome to the studio, Angela. And do you want to just tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Yep, I have a doctorate in physical therapy, and I've been practicing for 25 years, and just wanted to be on the show to talk about the importance of evidence-based medicine in our healthcare system. Sounds like you guys are having that discussion, and important, especially during the COVID pandemic and kind of the lack of transparency that kind of happened. Sounds like you're already covering that. So this was an important topic during that time, and I kind of dug in, and independent investigation of the truth was really important to me during the time, and felt kind of frustrated with what was happening. Yet I knew the kind of the pattern of the FDA, knowing and practicing during the opioid epidemic, knowing that big pharma, and knowing too during with the children, the epidemic of obesity in our schools. These are things with the FDA. So it was a pattern. So it wasn't like a huge shock, but I was still shocked with what was kind of going on. And recently I read the report that came out. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Jason, is the Alberta's COVID-19 pandemic response. So
I don't think I've read that. Yeah.
Okay, it's kind of going through the therapeutics, the vaccinations. It's a 269-page report with Dr. Gary Davidson is the doctor out of Canada, and they kind of laid out kind of what happened and how we could do better next time kind of idea, going through the therapeutics, the vaccination, the effects of lockdown and masking. And they also brought up the whole Great Barrington Declaration that Sweden was the only country that followed that and had the least amount of deaths out of any other country in the world. Very interesting. But one of the studies that I actually looked into this, it was the remdesivir, the antiviral medication that was used. That was the primary one that was being used. And in 2021, they have this in this report that there was only 3 studies that were used, and they were all, or 2 of them, I'm sorry, were Ebola. And 40 to 50% of these patients were going into kidney failure. And actually, in my local community, there was 2 people that actually passed away from kidney failure.
Which COVID causes, just so you know. It's one of the most common presentations of COVID is renal failure. It's a vascular disease. And what most people don't realize is that COVID causes microclotting throughout the body, and that's been documented. Myocarditis, which everyone sort of touted as being a vaccine side effect, which was seen in under 150 people worldwide, was much more common under COVID. So COVID is and remains a multi-organ disease. So renal failure actually is one of the presenting findings of COVID.
So allow me to interject a quick question here. And thank you, Angela, for bringing up those points. We'll come back to some of them. But on this specific point, this is personal curiosity, right? So how do we distinguish when there were some very high profile sudden issues that were very visible, whether it was a sports figure on national TV or this or that?
Oh, the died sudden bullshit. Sorry, I shouldn't say that on your show, but I mean that.
My point is the question. This is whether it's real or popular perception. The question. This is a topic of discussion. The question that I have for you is, how does one then distinguish myocarditis from COVID versus from a vaccine? When, for example, I believe I had COVID in January. We talked about that in the opening segment. I'm convinced of it, and I see no reason to doubt it. I also then later, and you agreed that many people had COVID, didn't know it before we even realized people were getting COVID. So there's really no way to know how many millions of people actually had COVID before the vaccines were even rolled out.
Correct.
Tens of millions of people who then also went and got the vaccine. And there was and this is one of the responses that maybe we should look into. There was zero interest in determining whether anybody already had COVID and thus already had a better natural immunity if they'd already had it than they would get from the vaccine. And now we have this mishmash of people who may have had COVID who also got the vaccine. And if they had renal failure, if they had myocarditis, if they had this, that, was it from the vaccine or was it from COVID? Was it from both? Neither? How does one sort out that tangled mess?
So a couple key points. There was a massive attempt to understand what the percentage of people were who had COVID very early on, even before the vaccine, to define the antibodies that could define that. 2 were found. One, which targeted the antibody to determine immunity, was the spike protein, which we all know is sort of what served as the vaccine, and the other was the core of COVID. So the way we can tell the difference between natural immunity and vaccine immunity is the vaccine only targets the spike protein. So you only produce antibodies against the spike protein. But natural COVID immunity, you also are able to make antibodies to the core of the virus.
Got it. So there's a way to determine that, but that way would probably not be consistently used to really figure out in all the individual cases when it comes to collecting data.
Well, so when the mRNA vaccines were released, it was with the caveat that absolutely any side effect we thought might be related gets reported to the vaccine reporting database. I reported several things myself, which were investigated and ultimately found to be not related to the vaccine, although there was one incident that was related to the vaccine. The far more than anything else, we were able to determine patients who got natural infection based on how antibodies go up and down in the blood when they got that, and determined that was what was causing the issues. So that helps a great deal. The second thing is you brought up immunity, and I had mentioned this at the top of the show. Long-term immunity does not exist for most viruses. Doesn't either for bacteria. Or fungi for that matter. We have an immune system whose job is to ramp up as quickly as possible. And for many common things, we do ramp up our immunity. But the common cold virus, rhinovirus, and the coronaviruses that aren't COVID, we never gain long-term immunity to. And so one of the concerns early on in the pandemic, and one of the reasons the search for a vaccine was so important, was it was causing severe damage to multiple organs in people of all ages. I lost 3 patients, normal immune systems, who were under the age of 25. I was there. And I really resent that, Gunnar, you think this was some scam. I can tell you it was no scam. It scarred me. It caused a third of the medical profession to resign. It was real, and I was there. So anyway, but back to this. The point is that we don't make good antibodies to coronaviruses. So the only way to sustain and maintain a sense of immunity would be to actually motivate it through vaccination. Now, vaccination is very interesting in that it helps train the immune system to a greater degree. You make more antibodies, there's more of a response, especially if it's targeted to something that your body sees first, such as the spike protein. And the spike protein was what all of the vaccines were there for. So there was a major effort, and it's interesting that the perception is that there wasn't in distinguishing these things. There was a very strong one. mRNA vaccines were not new, by the way. They started in the early 2000s.
Well, let me respond to that. It's more than a perception, because I would ask, because we were pretty much forced. Angela was in the medical field, so she had to get vaccinated very early on. She was one of those lucky people that got, first vaccine, right? And then others of us were basically forced into it, whether we wanted to or not. And I was talking a lot at that time about natural immunity, because I already was convinced at that time that I'd had COVID. And I remember talking to, you talk about education, this friend of mine has a PhD in economics. He's very well educated, extremely smart, educated. And I shared with him that, natural immunity is much better than vaccine immunity. And he said, no way. Vaccine immunity is much, much better. And nothing I would say would convince him. He was just so convinced vaccines deliver a better immunity.
They do.
You said earlier that they don't.
No, I said that.
Right?
No. I said they bolster. You get a bigger immune response. He's not wrong. So the studies that were interesting that came out about a year into COVID, a year after the vaccines, natural immunity fades somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks from COVID. In fact, there were many times where patients were getting COVID twice in a month from just natural immunity. That's just honest to God truth. Vaccine immunity was good, much better than natural immunity. But the sweet spot was when you had them both. So if you had both gotten COVID and got the vaccine, you had the highest titers of antibodies in your system targeting COVID. So natural immunity actually is very weak in COVID. And there are tons of data that you can look up on this. I see your wife shaking her head, but that's actually the fact. That's definitely the fact, and that's been replicated. If natural immunity were great, people wouldn't get COVID within weeks of each other. So that happens a lot during the viral peak season. We'll see people get COVID multiple times.
I think there are studies out there that show that natural immunity is better. That was included in this report out of Canada, that they showed that natural immunity was better.
There's one thing that natural immunity does that vaccines don't, and this is worth calling out, which is T-cell mediated immunity. So T cells are sort of the library, if you will, of prior diseases you've had. Vaccines don't really stir up the T cells to remember things, but they do produce a stronger antibody response. T-cell immunity is why we think that there is some benefit to natural immunity. The danger here is the early variants, much less so now, but the earlier variants maimed a lot of people. So we have seen a lot of examples of from especially the alpha, beta, and early delta variants that people who got those actually have earlier incidents of coronary disease, stroke, renal failure, and that was just the result of the natural thing. So that's what we were up against at the very beginning. Things have changed. And now I think it's reasonable to have that discussion with your provider as to whether or not it makes the same sense.
Yeah, I think that lack
Well,
of
and I think, Angela,
Go ahead, Angela.
well, I was just going to say, Angela, the things that you brought up are also in line with one of the questions here. So to put a point on some of the things that you were asking, Angela, and get into the studies that you brought up, was a question that said, Drew, what looking back, what do you think could have, would have, should have been done differently around the response to COVID? I'm looking for yeah, here we go. What should the medical community fess up to? What did they do wrong?
It's an interesting.
And this one here, if you had to redo COVID public policy, what would you have done differently?
Well, I think too, according to this study, is that there wasn't all the data presented to the people who were making these decisions. All the data was not presented. Again, they were biased in one viewpoint, kind of what you're saying is all this. There has to be an open discussion and diverse perspectives. Sadly, doctors were being canceled left and right who were sharing different information and saying, no, that's wrong, that's misinformation, and that is completely not the response. We all have to work together. We all might see it differently, but we need to come together as a community of diverse voices and share our perspectives in order. That's going to make us stronger, not saying you're wrong and I'm right. I think that we have to share all perspectives and look into these studies about natural immunity and not say, no, there's only one perspective. I think we have to have that discussion to make it our.
So I think you're bringing up a good point. A good point, Angela. However, the data are the data. So there's this piece over here. So people who are arguing with, ivermectin and Plaquenil, which is another drug, those have been repeatedly debunked. There's no opinion about that. That's been
in the studies you've read, but there are studies showing
no. There is randomized, large-scale clinical control data that has been done. That's the peak of science. They've been done that has debunked it time and again. You can look up the English Health Study. They have a very good system there in Britain for tracking things. I would never want to be in their hospitals, but they have a very good health system for monitoring this. This is definitively debunked. It's been debunked multiple times. In terms of autopsy studies that you're bringing up, debunked again about COVID, the vaccine causing death. COVID is a vascular disease. It causes blood clots. Somebody posted something about morticians finding blood clots everywhere. That's COVID. That's not the vaccine. The problem with science is, number one, you have to argue the science with good data. So if you come to me and say ivermectin cures COVID and you should be on this, there's a pretty high bar for you to show me that that actually works. And that bar was counterbalanced by the fact that ivermectin caused many people to suffer liver injury without any benefit to COVID. Now, that doesn't mean that everything we give you is good either. So, for example, you bring up remdesivir. Now, remdesivir is an interesting drug. It was pulled off the shelf, like you said, for Ebola. That's where we've actually used it because we were trying something, anything, to help those early people with the pandemic. We have learned that remdesivir should be for a very targeted population. And that population is exclusively those who are hospitalized requiring oxygen, who come in short of breath. That group of people benefits from remdesivir. Most everyone else doesn't. And so that's part of the problem, is that actually is, by the data, what we know. Where opinions come in are on public health policy. That's a very valid thing to discuss because we have to do that. But here again, the data showed us that we were wrong. We made mistakes. And that's easy to acknowledge. The idea that we could actually shut down everything so that the virus would not burn through our system had worked in prior attempts. So most people don't know that COVID is SARS-CoV-2. It's the SARS coronavirus 2. There was a SARS that occurred in the 2000s. And in the 2000s, they shut things down in Japan and in Southeast Asia, and the virus went away, and we have never seen it again, which is beautiful. We thought we could apply that globally. That was a huge mistake. We should have never done that. While it short-term decreased the burden of COVID, it ended up long-term causing a lot of harm to people who needed medical care. That shouldn't have happened. The mask controversy is very interesting. It is true that surgical masks reduce the risk of all viral infections. It's very important to know that. And if you are wearing a surgical mask and the person who has COVID wears a surgical mask, your chance of getting COVID is virtually zero. But we came out with some really crappy mask wearing suggestions based on data that was from an influenza epidemic back in 2009, H1N1. You guys may remember that one. In 2009, it was really taking over Japan, and they tried doing qualitative studies looking at mask use and spread of disease, and found, in fact, that mask use didn't reduce disease. We learned later, of course, with COVID that it's not just droplet ice that you get, it's airborne. And for airborne type viruses, the only thing that definitively helps you is a well-fit N95 mask. So that was wrong too. So we gave very poor advice. Now, the difference in science is this isn't just an opinion, it's an evolution over time. We do the best we can. And now we've learned for future pandemics that these things just don't work. We harmed kids. I own that. We harmed society. We destroyed businesses. That was all in an attempt to apply the data as best we saw it. But now we have those data that show, you know what, larger scale, this doesn't go upward. So
a couple of quick questions to follow on to that. One, if one had to do it all over again today, are you saying no lockdowns in the way that we had them? That's a pretty big change.
But it's based on the data. It's based on the data. So when people say there's two sides to the issue, science doesn't look at it as two sides. It's what the data show. And one of the things that is infuriating, and part of the reason you asked me on the show, is this erosion of trust in science. Part of it is that is the scientific process. Show me the data. Data don't have opinions. Now, somebody mentioned it depends on who's funding the studies, and that's a fair argument for sure. And always you want to know who's actually funding them.
Yeah, there's obviously a bias, right? Money
talks.
The love of money, a desire for money, a desire to have your project funded, a desire to have your institution funded. That is a systemic bias. I mean, if there is systemic racism in this country, if there's any validity whatsoever to systemic racism, don't try to tell me there's no validity to systemic money bias in the system.
I didn't say anything about that.
I'm not. It's just a formulation. Yeah. I didn't mean it the way it sounded.
However, what I will say is, the beauty of science is it self-corrects over time, because sure, there's some hot and fancy drug that gets FDA approved because money's changing hands, but it eventually comes back.
Right. We no longer use leeches. We no
We
longer
still
use
use leeches.
bloodletting.
That's not
That
true.
time,
I have leeches on formula.
okay.
We use it in plastic surgery to help
Well,
with wounds.
that self-correcting over time can be beyond the horizon of what's reasonable in some cases, right? And that's the problem. The other question I have is, you said a third of the medical community resigned or
Yeah.
something like that. What the heck?
Yeah,
I haven't heard
a
that.
third
So tell us about
of nurses, doctors, physical therapists, you take the spectrum, left the profession after COVID. We were traumatized
why.
because of burnout. So I don't think people can understand what it's like to watch a bunch of people die and then to come home and hear on the news that people think it was bullshit. I don't think you can appreciate how we struggled as hard as we could with an unknown. Initially, we're called healthcare heroes, and then we're told that we're some, cabal, and that's really hard on people. When we were trying to do the best we could with what we understood, we made mistakes, but the data pointed us in the right direction, and that's the problem. People have no tolerance. So one of the things that was interesting was one of the arguments for ivermectin and for Plaquenil and all of these other things is it's better than doing nothing. And most of us were like, wait, we need studies. We're not going to make a recommendation until there's definitive studies. And that's why you didn't see a vaccine until November of 2020. mRNA vaccines had been primed back in the 2000s for SARS-1 and had been tested in humans for many, many years. The only thing that was changing was the mRNA strand, which is not a DNA strand. It can't affect your own genome, no matter how many people think that that's true. And so, when I hear there's two sides to this, I'm like, there's not. There's theory, there's execution on that theory, and then there's the data. And the data come out. Now, controversial data may have things on both sides of the spectrum, and we have to acknowledge that can happen. But there were people who are out blatantly spreading misinformation and continue to do so. It is disturbing to me, for example, that anyone should think that measles vaccines are not as good as developing a natural immunity to that. People die because of that. And we're seeing measles outbreaks all over the world, not just in Texas and New Mexico. And to me, it's ridiculous. People shouldn't be dying for this. And to have the parents of the 6-year-old who died say, I'm glad we didn't get the vaccine. I don't recommend it. You shouldn't get it too. We don't mind that she went to God. Like, God puts people in our lives to help us. I mean, faith is what helps me hear other people. And, that's just my take.
Well, I just want to comment to all those healthcare providers or workers who may be listening into this, or who may view it, or even just the ones you were referring to. We often have anti-war activists, right? Many of whom are very quick to simultaneously show support for the servicemen, even as they are out protesting war. I think that's a fitting analogy here for those who are not, attacking on the ground healthcare providers. The bulk and the majority of anyone I've ever talked to is concerned about systemic bias, funding, big pharma. That's been brought up. We haven't really got into that. Also, factual history about, the whole research that was done and how that research was illegal here in the U.S. and the funding was obtained to move it to Wuhan. Fauci was involved in that early on. These are some of the things that, if you do a little research, you can become aware that there's a whole history here as to why he was the expert. And again, the transparency on some of that, the blanket pardon that was granted for any and all sins ever committed, by the outgoing administration. These things also erode faith, because transparency and accountability is lacking.
Well, I mean, don't go to the government if you want transparency.
Amen.
Yeah, and with the vaccination, it was claimed safe and effective, yet Pfizer wouldn't release their clinical studies. I waited and waited, and I read the thousands of side effects, and I was like, nobody really knows all the side effects from the
I
vaccination.
mean,
They
they
did release
absolutely
it, and
published
there
it.
was 1,000 side effects, including ALS, including stroke, including myocarditis. They had the list of side effects from the vaccination. But
So
again,
just to be
when
clear,
it
ALS was
was
not wrong.
released, that was
TBS.
like a year
TBS.
after, about a year after it was released. And they were saying they weren't going to release it for like 25 years. That was their original thing. They were saying, Pfizer's like, we're not releasing these clinical studies.
Oh, it's going
And
to
they
take time
blacked
to
out a
release
lot
it,
of
and we'll
stuff. They
release X
blacked
number
out. So
per
again, the
years,
lack
and
of transparency,
Yeah,
saying, oh, these are safe and effective, and yet we know that they weren't preventing transmission. So what's the effective? And we're trying to get herd immunity, but they
yeah,
don't
herd
help
immunity
with
should have never
transition.
been the goal. It should have never been the
But
goal.
that's
There's
what
no
it
way
was.
to.
That's what we were told. That's what the public was told.
And actually, I had a blog that from very early on, I'm like, herd immunity is a myth. You don't get herd immunity this way. Herds are fine when you are in herds. When you're in globalization,
Well,
you can't really achieve that unless you have a virus that's potent enough to actually have a sustained immunity for a long period of time, like years. And we don't have a lot of good examples of those. Well, chickenpox is probably the best one. If you got chickenpox, you have sustained immunity until you reactivates as shingles later on. But chickenpox is also not benign. It actually kills kids. It leads to deafness. It causes cerebral infections and all these other things that a lot of people are like, well, I got through it and I'm fine. So this is one of the biggest differences between science and theory. So, and I think this comes down to a fundamental truth, which is our own. So there's a book on how doctors think. It's called How Doctors Think. And it talks about the science of heuristics. And heuristics is basically our shortcuts, our mental shortcuts that we take so we can survive the day, right? So if I see some car swerving on the road, I immediately think, oh, that's a threat. And they're probably on their phone and they're probably drunk. And that's actually pretty good for me to think that. So I stay away from that car, maybe call it in, do that sort of thing. And that's a good shortcut. An example of a bad shortcut we do is racial bias, where we assume all people of one race or background or whatever are bad people. That's not a great bias, but that is a heuristic jump. We do heuristics to kind of boil everything down to very simple things. And when you look at doctors, they are guilty as heuristics as anyone else. I gave this person this vaccine and they got sick, so vaccines are bad. My Aunt Margie got COVID. She did fine, so COVID's fine. So personal experience, unfortunately, still shapes a lot of our experiences as human beings, and we try to come above that as doctors. But anecdotal experience is actually the lowest quality data you can have. That you may be right, 1 and 1 are 2, but more likely than not, you're observing an individual's response to anything. One of my favorite things that one of my professors said in medical schools, he said, tell this lady about the dangers of being on anticoagulation for preventing stroke. And so I went through a very scientific discussion that, this reduces your risk of stroke by 3%, which is actually pretty substantial, And then we walked out of the room and he said, you know what, Jason, that was a great discussion. And that's what all the data show. He said, but for any one individual patient, it's always 50-50. They're either going to get the outcome or they're not going to get the outcome. It's like, that's the difference between a personal experience and populational health. And the problem is that people are putting up personal experience. So the funniest part about, like, a great example of this is there was this died suddenly hashtag of all these young people dying. Statistics have already gone through and there has been no increased number of people dying in their youth than there ever was. Not after the vaccine, not at all. There's a background rate of people dying in their youth suddenly, often from cardiac anomalies that they can find at autopsy and sometimes none. The best woman for my wife at our wedding, she died unexpectedly, autopsy negative. Autopsies are only positive 25% of the time. We have no idea what killed her. This was before COVID. But, by all means, the vaccine. It's, again, this, I can't explain it, so somebody's to blame. That is an actual very good survival mechanism for a species. If you see Trog eat a mushroom and die, even if he died from cardiac anomalies, it's a good idea to probably avoid that mushroom, but they're not necessarily causally linked. And humans are inherently bad at getting out of their way to see things without their bias. That's what science tries to offer, is let's look at the data. Now, does the data get manipulated? Sometimes it does. Great example, Wakefield. Wakefield forged complete medical records on 10 kids back in, I think, 1970s, when he was trying to create a vaccine that would compete for the European, in England, the European vaccine for the tetanus diphtheria shot. He wanted to create one that was different than the one that was being offered and make money off of it. So he had 10 kids who he diagnosed with autism, threw several of his acquaintances onto a paper, submitted the paper to the Lancet, was accepted by the Lancet. And then when his co-authors realized that they had had their name attached, immediately read the data and said, this is complete BS. He was trying to make a link between autism and vaccines. That has never left the popular culture. And yet, the reason we're seeing more and more kids with the diagnosis of autism is our diagnostic tools have become better at identifying autism and helping people get treatment for that. That's called a lead time bias. It has nothing to do with vaccines, but people continue to say they got the vaccine and the next day they were different. Well, maybe one person, that's the 50-50. Maybe that did happen and it's hard to tell. But on populational, this has been debunked time and again, and he was proven to be fraudulent, and yet he is still the hero of the anti-vax community, even though he's a complete huckster.
So we're gonna pause now and quickly go to a commercial break. We have an author who's actually with us here commenting. We appreciate that. Who's written a book that has kind of a tie-in here in terms of historical analysis on and judgment on a difficult topic. Don't go anywhere. We're going to come right back and interact a little bit with the audience comments before we conclude.
They say the courtroom is where truth comes to light. For one neurosurgeon, it became a test of everything he believed in: his skills, his integrity, his resilience, and his belief in his chosen field. A patient's life forever changed. A Native American husband searching for accountability. A skilled defense attorney trained by the Native American psychologist, and a doctor caught in the middle, fighting to defend not just his actions and his humanity, but medicine in general. Written in real time as the trial proceeded, About Not Losing takes you behind the scenes of a high-stakes malpractice trial, offering a rare look through the eyes of the accused, the attorney fighting by his side, and the psychologist analyzing it all. But this is more than a story about the law. It's a story about the many diverse people involved in a trial. It's also a story of resilience in the face of adversity, of the unlikely friendships that can emerge from conflict, and the strength it takes to move forward when the world seems against you. And even after the trial ended, a recurring dream compelled him to address the lingering questions, turning pain into purpose and closure into a deeper understanding of what truly matters. About Not Losing. A high-stakes trial, life's purpose found. Scan the QR code to get your copy now.
Welcome back. We're here with Jason Persoff talking about erosion of faith in science in the wake of the COVID epidemic. We felt that ad was a nice tie-in. That's a court case that happened, I'm not sure, 40 years ago, and finally got a book on it to study what happened. So in the wake of this now, and Angela, you brought up this paper from Canada that's analyzing the response. Jason, you admitted certain things would be done very differently today. What's the conclusion here from us here before we go maybe look at a few of the audience comments? What are your thoughts, Jason?
I think we need to, if you don't want pharmaceutical companies doing research, we need to fund the universities and fund the NIH because you're going to get the best data from less biased sources if you don't have to give in to the drug companies. So just to call out that it's important for us to keep these funding streams open. They seem very expensive, but they actually generate good science, which is.
Well, you also wrote a paper, and I don't know if it's now been published or if it's still under review.
Yeah, no, it's we are just finishing editing it to submit for peer review. And what we believe is that the biggest thing is that science is communicated poorly. It has to be communicated better. it has to actually be done in a social media savvy way, because scientists suck at that, but actually is really important to get people to understand the situation. And I think Angela's point about transparency is very clear. What we know and what we don't know needs to be very clear. What I would encourage people to learn is that when somebody has this idea that it's the stuff doctors don't want you to know, none of us goes into this. None of us. Some people do go into this profession to do shifty things. I mean, that does happen. But most of the people who are in science are doing this because they want to better themselves and their families, and help the community as a whole. So when you hear claims that there's a huge suppression of data, what did not get suppressed during COVID was the number of people infected, the number of people dying. The VAERS database was very solid. That was the vaccine-related injury database. It was very solid. That information is transparent. We need to do better about being completely transparent, but you need to do better as a group for people who are out there in weighing whether you're hearing somebody's opinion or the cold hard fact. And the reality is that today on X or any other platform, it's easier to see something dramatic that makes you angry. And anytime you get angry, you should check yourself that's just appealing to emotion. And science is not done with emotion most of the time. Science is just looking at the facts, understanding the facts, getting more data, and self-correcting over time. But if you're angry because of something that you've seen, don't assume a cover-up. Be educated. And also don't assume that whatever somebody says doctors don't want you to know and drug companies don't want you to have. That's definitely not true. As a physician, I can write things off label and have done when the data shows that needs to be done that way to help somebody. So we really need to learn to take care of each other instead of trying to find enemies, because even the best intentioned people make mistakes. Somebody asked, what about God as a heuristic? So I will tell you 100%, my relationship with God is very solid, and I can sometimes hear him. But the only place I consistently hear him is through other people, and that's humility. And it's important to have humility. When you have righteous indignation, that may be right, but most of the time it's just ego. That's been my experience. And we need to take the passions down a notch and really think about this. Being a scientist means being wrong. If you're a scientist who falls in love with your theories, the science will eventually correct you. But the other part is that it takes time for science to self-correct, which sucks, but it's the reality. And we're learning that.
Well, and thank you for those comments. They're well received and well thought out. Obviously, a result of a lot of reflection, some introspection, and humility on your part. So very much appreciated. I do want to bring up somewhat of a counter to a couple of the things, and that is what Angela brought up earlier, which is the opioid epidemic, right? The opioid epidemic is perhaps one of the major counter arguments, in the sense that, yes, science, yes, intentions, yes, data, and nonetheless, something entered into the system.
Oh yeah.
That led to this was a man-made crisis, and I would say it is undeniable that greed was behind it. The opioid crisis was itself a virus that infected the entire medical system and apparatus. I'll call it the medical industrial complex of this country. And obviously the people who went along with it, who got addicted, I'm not absolving them of blame either. They were the ones who, maybe inflated their pain score on that little smiley chart and said, oh, my pain's an 8 today because I want that thing you're pushing. But the system was susceptible to this virus, the entire system. And it went on for decades. And millions of people were harmed, and millions of lives were made considerably worse. What are we doing to address that immune deficiency in the entire medical industrial complex?
Yeah,
that may be a topic for another show, because
but it's an interesting question. So That was a great example of the Sacklers are, Sacklers have been hucksters for a long time, but they also were greasing the wheel.
They're the evil villain, but they exploited a number of weaknesses in the system.
They did.
And that's
Well,
what I'm addressing.
so
I'm not addressing
here's the
them.
problem with that. So pain is not objective. So one of the biggest problems is my pain, your pain, they're completely different. And what they sold, and I trained during the spin up of this opioid epidemic, and I contributed to it. I wrote prescriptions for OxyContin for stupid things. And part of the problem is that the data of quality of life, which they sort of bandied about, made it seem like there was an epidemic of untreated pain. It became the fifth vital sign. It was genius. It was absolutely genius.
No, there's an epidemic of people who are terrified of the slightest
Understood,
pain and want to.
But that is mostly an American problem. When you go to Europe, that is not the case. So there is, and I think this is what makes it a little bit different, is they exploited something that is subjective, varies from person to person, has no objective testing, and basically they exploited it to make it sound like, look at how much better these people's lives are when their pain is treated.
But any normal person with common sense, I mean, I consider myself a normal person with common sense, saw that coming a mile away. I remember seeing the little smiley face charts, and I'm like, what bullshit? Somebody coming in and telling the doctor what their pain was. That was even before I correlated it to the fact that there was, an opioid involved, that these people were pushing, they were drug pushers, obviously.
I was. And the problem is that again, from a scientific standpoint, when you move into subjectivity, it gets really, really difficult to do controlled studies on. And pain is one of them. Emotions are another, not depression, but like emotions. So, how often do you feel sad? Well, it may be very intrinsically okay for you to feel sad every day. You like those little things. You like the cry movies and stuff like this. That may be who you are. Doesn't mean you're depressed. When you get into subjective realities, that's one of the biggest problems, which is what we've seen. Obviously, they took advantage of. And in addition to that, money everywhere. And money corrupts. So absolute money corrupts. Absolutely. There's no question about this. However, I still have faith in science as a whole because of its ability to self-correct. Now, in this case, the medical community got blindsided because patients reported significant, and I had patients who couldn't walk because they had bad arthritis, they had their knees replaced, and that didn't solve it. They were still going to physical therapy. They were doing maximally everything they could. We put a little OxyContin in their food, and oh my God, they actually are out there playing tennis and having a good life. We saw this. And again, that's the subjective part of this. We saw that.
Yep.
We didn't see the addiction until it was too late. And that's when it happened. So my point is, there's only so much that we're humans. And that was a big mistake. So what are we doing in Science Week?
This gets into the many layers of the onion of the complexity of what it means to be human, the psychology of illness, the psychology of the patient-doctor relationship. This is what I mean by science is in its infancy, because there are so many fields of study to approach these problems holistically.
Well, but here's the thing. Americans, as a group, don't want holistic. They want easy solutions. Here's a great example for you. The intervention of birth in America is epidurals, drugs. Doesn't exist elsewhere on the planet. I'm not sure about Canada if they do it similarly, but in Europe, that isn't what you do. You go to a midwife until you risk out of it. You don't get epidurals unless there's an absolute indication to do it. The anticipation in America from American women is birth is painful, it's hellish. You will do anything you can to avoid having a natural birth. I'm happy to have a scheduled C-section. That is the American thing. And that result of that is our mortality of our infants is higher than almost every country in the world that has natural birth. Not kidding. Maternal mortality, we're one of the leading causes of
we can now go on for another hour or
If
two.
you
I'm just
want,
going to give an
I'm
end.
good. What do you want to do?
No, we're going to have you back if you're willing, but I'm going to give an anecdote to tee that up. And I will submit that when I was a child in Sweden, we talked about Sweden and COVID. When I was a child in Sweden, I went there in 4th grade. I was plucked out of America, didn't speak a word of Swedish, dropped into a Swedish family in Swedish society. Advertising to children was banned in Sweden. Completely banned entirely. Not only that, advertising on TV, we had state-funded TV. There was no advertising. The point is, I went from one experience in America to one there, and it was like whiplash shock, and it caused me to reflect. Why are Americans the way they are? Because money has infused every aspect of our society. That is one of the vulnerabilities as to why the opioid crisis, because it's not just these people, those people, every single person in the system of systems is susceptible and has been made susceptible to be pain adverse, simple solutions, buy your way out of a problem. There's a whole complex of issues and problems that made us as a nation susceptible. And I'm glad you called it out as a uniquely American problem.
It really is. And it's funny, you talk about system of systems. One of the biggest mistakes that ever was made was direct to consumer marketing of any drug product. It's very interesting. My wife is German. When we're in Germany, it's amazing. You don't go to an apothecary or apotheke. You go to talk to the pharmacist, who will then recommend what you should take. So you can't just go there and say, I'm going to go grab some ibuprofen. You go and you talk to a pharmacist, and that kind of connection, learning to have a connection over time with somebody who cares about your health, is far better than the American I can do it on my own, which is a very common mentality, which is the same reason that people don't want to see doctors. In addition to, God, yes, I know it's expensive. I'm sorry. This is another major thing, is that healthcare should be a right. Sorry, it's my personal beliefs. You don't have to agree. That's fine. But
to what degree, should it?
I don't think that there should be. I don't think there should be kids who are dying from cancer because parents can't afford the drugs. Period. And we can talk about the price of drugs some other time. But my point being, in America, we're taught if we Google it enough, run it through ChatGPT enough, we're going to get the right answer. And what you really need is a good longitudinal relationship with somebody who you learn to trust over time, who knows when they don't know something. That's hard, but that's what you want. If you're looking for a doctor, that's what you're looking for in a doctor. And you may find that actually in advanced practice practitioners such as PAs and NPs more than physicians. I don't know, but that's the best advocate you can have, is to have a relationship and be willing to go to that relationship. Because here's the greatest example. People think they can do their healthcare on their own. Some people don't even know how to change the oil in their car. I mean, and more to the point, again, one last thing that I was thinking about is, if I ask you, what are the odds when I flip a coin, it's going to be head or tails? They'll tell me it's 50-50. That's not true. If I do it 10 times, it's probably going to be something like 7-3. I have to do this study a number of times repeatedly until eventually I come to the truth. And people who are used to looking for those studies and understanding that should be your best advocates. I'm not saying they are, but they should be.
Right. So we're going to have to crash land the plane. I wanted
to
let Angela have the last word here and share her perspective on this.
Thanks. Thank you for meeting with us. This is awesome discussion, and nice to hear your perspectives on all these ideas. So like we said, I'm a Baha'i, and in the Baha'i writings, it says, in the future, a skilled physician will diagnose through food, right? They will balance, and in rare occasions, they will use compound medicines. And I look forward to that. Not probably in my lifetime, but that will be the wave of the future. It will be diagnosed. Unfortunately, our food, like we talked about, the agricultural system is terrible. Our food, like we said, to get the nutrients out of 1 pound of carrots in the 1950s, you had 1 pound of carrots, 10 pounds you need to eat of carrots today to get the same nutrients out of 1 pound in 1950, right? So our food system is majorly a part of this problem. So anyways, that was my last comment to say. In the future, I look forward to the skilled physician
And
diagnosing.
to support that, Angela, the patient needs to realize that they carry a large responsibility to change behaviors, to change choices, lifestyle choices, right? And I don't think the medical community as it exists, they have a bias against that, if anything, right? The bias should be towards helping people make behavioral choices that are better for them.
Well, remember,
I think doctors don't even really get education in nutrition. I've talked to many doctors; they don't get any education in nutrition, unfortunately.
I got some, but I was lucky. But what I will say is, again, it's the expectation that people come in, and in America, the expectation is, I do whatever the hell I want. You fix me,
right?
And
I
Agreed.
I can only work so much with that. I can't talk to any drunk who's gotten sober. The thing that matters is that they kind of reached a place where they realized they needed help, and they stopped trying to keep doing the things that were causing them harm. Yeah. And the reality is, most people are unwilling to stop doing the things that cause them harm. They want to live in their echo bubble, and because it's safe, and it's uncomfortable when somebody says, this is a complex problem and we need to come out with a complex solution. How many people come for back pain and don't want to go to physical therapy to get it better, right?
I had a 30-year-old female who had a spondylolisthesis. She just wanted to have surgery. No.
Right. Oh, yeah. Piece of cake. That fixes it all the time. Less than half. I mean, it's just, it's an American mentality, and we would do well taking a page from the rest of the world, but we don't see it that way. It's America first right now. So,
outgoing question, you don't have to answer it now, but it might be something worth looking into. And that is, no, it's gonna open up too many can of worms. Never mind. So when we have you back, there are many topics to discuss still.
Yep.
So grateful to you, Jason, for appearing here. I don't know that we completely agree. We'll continue to have different perspectives, but I so welcome having you on the show.
As you and I have talked about, you having a different opinion is also God speaking to me, right? I have to listen to everything and then weigh what feels right. So to me, this is a spiritual experience, and that's the beautiful thing about this. So it's been great. I really enjoyed it. And Angela, I'm sorry if I stepped on your toes repeatedly.
No,
I get so excited about this stuff. It's like, I just can't help myself.
No, it's good. It's good. We're sharing our diverse perspectives.
Yeah,
diversity
exactly.
in perspective is good, because we believe only in the clash of different opinions does the spark of truth arise. And fortunately, that does not happen again in healthcare, when you can't say no natural. You know what I mean? I think there's a place for both, and we need to come together to find the truth. If we're only like, this is the only way, it can only be that way, that's when I'm like, wait a minute, no. There's other ways, and we have to be open to seeing and knowing our own biases. And we're all like guilt. We all see it through that lens. So that's why we need
good survival
each
mechanism.
other to discuss these ideas so we can learn and grow together. So I'm thankful. I didn't think you stepped on my toes. Good.
Gratitude.
Yeah,
definitely.
All right. Well, the only remaining task now is to play the sneak peek for next week's episode. We actually had next week's guest in the audience commenting. We'll look forward to hearing his story and his opinions on life and how he got where he was next week. Until then, may God be with you all. Hello, everyone. It's Wade Franson back with another sneak peek for Created in the Image of God. This time, it's the April Fool's Day show, April 1st, with Gunnar Lindblom. He's known as the Gifted Gangster. He was once an enforcer for the Detroit Mafia. Why would we have this man on a show called Created in the Image of God? Well, he had inspiring events while he spent 13 years in prison and transformed into a best-selling writer full of faith, come with us to this episode to learn about second chances and perseverance and faith in God. Welcome to the studio, Gunnar.
Thanks for having me. Except I think this is the wrong day. April Fool's. I'm just April Fool's and you. I'm just kidding. Thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
Well, one of the things I love about you is your ability to approach things with a smile and a little bit of a sense of humor. So how is it that you have recovered from being in the mafia and all the stories and 13 years in prison? How is it that you have this attitude today of looking at life with a twinkle in your eye and a smile and success?
Well, first of all, I was never in the mafia. So I was associated with the mafia as my family, and I was around it all my life. When I became a criminal in my teens and 20s, some of those old gangsters are like, hey, you want to make some money? And I said, yeah. And I was already a bad kid, but not a great kid. I was just in a lot of trouble. I think I had 8 felonies by the time I was 17. So that's the kind of kid I was. But then, in prison, I turned it around. I gave my life to God, and it sounds very cliche, but it's not. God found me when I was in solitary confinement for 19 months, spoke to my heart, told me he would protect me and that I had a gift, and that gift was writing. And so it just led to everything I have today. My whole life, my wife, my home, everything. It all started at that moment.
Well, so thank you for clarifying that. I guess that's why you ended up in prison, because the guys in the mafia, right? They're maybe a little bit more protected, right? And you got cut loose. I don't know. I don't necessarily want to get into that side of the story in this sneak peek, but what I do want to ask is about that wife you mentioned. You met her while you were still in prison, right? And so you had kind of an inside-outside dating relationship. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, long story short is I was writing novels in prison. A friend of mine who was a man of God, who was inspired by God himself to reach out to me years earlier, had robbed the guy 8 years before I went to prison. And then God touched his heart, he said he wants to look out for you. So he sent me money for paper and pens. For the next 6 years, I wrote about a book a year. He was really blown away. He posted samples of my 6th book, To Be a King, on Facebook. A woman who worked for a publisher stumbled across them, read them, say they were really good, like to read the full manuscript. I had somebody send her the full manuscript. She was blown away, said it was the best book she ever read. And essentially, we became pen pals after that. She was going to help me get published, and we just started writing letters more and more and more. And slowly but surely, we fell in love, and she waited almost 7 years for me.
Wow. So we are not fooling. Show up for Created in the Image of God on April 1st for an hour with Gunnar Lindblom, former mafia enforcer, man of God, survivor of prison. You don't want to miss this episode. See you there.